So today's session, as I said at the start, is about growing TED and also linking it in with staff survey. So we are going to be running other sessions where we link things to staff survey over the coming months. But absolutely, I think at this time of year, OD and HR colleagues, staff survey is one of the big things on your mind. You'll likely have received your results. They're still under embargo, so you might not have shared them too widely, but you'll definitely be thinking around what does that staff survey response look like? How can we engage with teams? How can we empower them to take action based on the feedback? And what I really wanted to do was sort of frame today's session in that context, which you're likely at the minute. So the key learning point from today are around keeping momentum with your TED growth. I recognise you'll all be at perhaps slightly different stages with your TED, but hopefully there's lots of useful tips and tricks in there today. But also how to build on TED engagement and align it with your wider offer. So that might include your staff survey response or other programs that you might run. What we're looking to do is share some opportunities for growing TED, get you thinking around what those opportunities might be in your own organisation context, and also think how that might knit in with your staff survey and with those next steps that you're already starting to plan. So why are we focusing on growth? I think we've decided to focus on this because we've had a lot of questions recently over the last few months, and really since we started offering TED externally. Similar sorts of questions crop up when you're on that TED journey, when you've maybe gone past that initial introduction and you're thinking around how do we keep this going? How do we keep growing it maybe year on year? So we've designed this session around a number of questions that we've heard when Sam and I have been coming, meeting you in some of our catch-ups, through some of our coffee catch-up events, which quite a few of you have contributed to. So although we know you're all in different places in terms of where you're up to with your TED progress, we hope that we can provide you with today some useful perspectives on where you might currently be at, what you can do to help stimulate that growth in terms of your TED numbers, get different teams interested, and how you continue that momentum into 2024. We also want you to think around what your next steps might be for engaging with different types of teams, as well as keeping momentum with the teams who've used it already and how you get them to do follow-up TEDs to make it part and parcel of that team culture. So I just wanted to share with you a selection of those questions that have come up, and no doubt quite a few of you will have these on your mind. So we've been asked, how can we keep teams doing TED? And that might refer to teams that have done it once before, and how we get them to re-engage with it when it comes to follow-up time. Some of you might be asking, how can we get team leaders to come on our TED training? We've seen lots of different innovative approaches to team leader training from different trust organisations. But it's important to really think around what that offer is. How is it meeting the needs of different stakeholders in our trust? And it's definitely something which has been part of the journey we've been on at Lancs Teaching, because we've evolved our team leader training. And really, I don't think there's a one size fits all approach to this. You can adapt it to meet different stakeholders across your trusts. Next one, many teams are maybe saying they don't have time. What can they do? And I think this is particularly relevant at the moment. We're still in that winter pressures sort of time of year where teams are really stretched. There's maybe a lot of sickness absence as well. So the idea of doing something like TED can be quite daunting, especially for a team that's never done this before, because it might feel like it's really onerous, or it might be a huge task to deal with when they are feeling under pressure or really stretched. Next question, when did TED become business as usual for Lancashire Teaching Hospitals? So I hope to go into some of that, what's been our journey with it. And absolutely what we aim for is that it does become business as usual for every team. What I do want to caveat that with is we're still on that journey at Lancs Teaching. It isn't business as usual for every single team in our trust, but what I want to do is try and illustrate the story we've been on and how that is becoming more the case as we keep growing TED over the years. Next one, some of our trust have asked us, we only managed a handful of teams in year one. Are we doing something wrong? And hopefully today will give you that confidence that even with just a small start, there are still opportunities to grow on that, to build on what you've already done, and also to shine that perspective on it can be challenging at first, and it's thinking around, you know, how do we keep things going as we move forward. And finally, one I know we get asked a lot is how can we show that TED is making an impact? And that again is something which we've seen at Lancs Teaching gets easier as more and more teams engage with TED, as you get more teams on board. So definitely something we want to try and encourage today, and with all of our support that we provide. Okay, so I wanted to start by really placing these questions in the perspective of what our journey has been at Lancs Teaching Hospitals. We've shared this data at numerous different events, but I think the importance of looking at this data in terms of our TED numbers over the years shows how sometimes it might be unfair to compare yourselves to where we're at Lancs Teaching. We're 7 years down the line with TED, so sometimes I'm always cautious to talk about our numbers without giving that full context that we didn't just jump up to 100 and odd teams in year one. It took us a while to get there. And I guess what I want to highlight with this data is that really at the start it was quite slow for us. So it's absolutely expected that it can be a challenge when you first set off with this. Of course, what we hope is that through our experience at Lancs Teaching and through our support and that advantage of the hindsight that we've got, that we can help you mobilize this perhaps quicker than us, or we can help you avoid some of the pitfalls that we might have had, help you learn from our shared experience and also from the experience of others who are going on this same journey along with you. We can see from this data that we've had a journey of gradual improvements. So we've had some dips along the way, and we continue to learn and improve. What we've always wanted to do with TED is buck the trend of initiative-itis. I'm sure there's a better word for that, but I do hear it called initiative-itis a lot. And we see an awful lot in the NHS that there will be new things that come along, and we'll try them, but they don't quite get the traction, or something will change, so we'll bring in something new. So we've been very conscious with our approach to TED that we wanted to grow it organically, so it's sustainable, but also keep it consistent throughout the years. So as much as we've upgraded TED throughout the years, and the platform which you now use is far more sophisticated than what we used to, at the core of it, we've wanted to keep it as a accessible, team-based survey initially, but a team-based approach with some practical steps through the toolkits that any team can get involved in. So when a lot of you will have been on my initial accreditation training, when your trust first signs up to TED, this is one of the slides that I use. So when you're thinking about rolling out TED across your organisation, this model is called the diffusion of innovation curve. But essentially what it does is highlight the importance of, firstly, those innovators, your early adopters as well, because they play an important part in setting the tone and helping you build a platform to then build on as time goes forward. So when you set out on your TED journey, it's likely for all of you, you'll have had this initial impact from those perhaps more innovative teams. It might have been your own team that you worked in that were one of those teams to first take that step and do a TED, or there might be other teams who were super keen to get involved. Maybe they just heard a little bit about it and decided they wanted to jump in. So almost dropped up there. So it's likely your early work with TED utilised that energy of these engaged team leaders, and if you feel there's there's those engaged team leaders out. Absolutely harness that energy. We're really fortunate at Lancs Teaching that we do have some great role models out in our trust, those team leaders who do really live the TED approach and really talk positively about it, and that means so much to us. And it helps our work from an OD perspective in getting the word out there about TED and encouraging others to use it. It's also likely that when you started out, and Sam and I know from talking to numerous different clients, how you'll also want to have targeted perhaps some of those at the opposite end of the scale. So these might be the teams who perhaps need TED the most. Quite often they might be teams who are maybe a bit more disengaged, so there'll be a bit more of a challenge and you do have to get more hands-on. So absolutely, we want TED to be available for those teams, because that's where you might see the biggest impact in terms of change in team cultures. But it's important to acknowledge that those are the ones that will need that extra support, and it might not be a quick and easy solve. It's not just a case of doing a TED. It might be longer term support to get them to that position where it does become business as usual for them. It's likely you might also have thought about maybe your stretch teams who would otherwise have engaged with some of your support measures that you put on, but maybe needed something like TED which can flex to suit their needs, with something which doesn't require them having a team away day, or something which doesn't require them to come on a set course or something like that. So TED can also be a great way to make engagement accessible for those types of stretch teams. And I think some of you, depending on how long you've been involved in TED, I know some of you might have been on for a couple of years now, you're likely at a stage where you start to be tapping into some of those early adopters who maybe we wouldn't class as innovators because they didn't put themselves forward right at the start, but they've maybe heard from another team that you've worked on TED with, or they've maybe spoken to another team member or a team leader who's talked about what they're doing, and that's piqued their interest. And I think for many of you, this might be where you're at the moment. You're thinking around, how do we begin to sort of grow it from those initial engaged teams, the teams that we're hands-on with, and build it into this situation, which we all want to get to, where it becomes business as usual for the majority of teams. So I've always said that TED is really about culture change. It's about changing team culture at a local level, but doing that with a view to influencing the organizational culture as a whole. And it's only when you get into that majority of teams, those, the majority of teams who maybe aren't on either extreme of this sort of scale, but are the ones who absolutely can start to build up that word of mouth and can really take you past that tipping point. So when we consider this model, the sort of sweet spot for that tipping point, and in answer to that question around when did TED become business as usual, I guess is sort of illustrated by this model. So it suggested that between 15 and 20% of your market out there, your customer base, your teams in TED context, is when you start to get to that tipping point where I don't want to say it becomes self-sustainable, because I'm sure, as Jude and Sam will testify, we still do an awful lot of work at Lancs Teaching to keep TED involved with teams, keep teams on with it, engage with new teams. But what I would say is it becomes easier over time, because the benefits are that you've got advocates out there in your organisation. You've got that selection of teams that have already used the approach. You've got some really great feedback, maybe some great case studies to share. So that's when it becomes a little bit easier in terms of that organisational rollout. So looking back at our data from Lancs Teaching, we know from our staff survey that we're roughly around 500 teams when we look at locality 4. So really, in terms of our journey, we've only really gone past that 20% threshold a couple of years ago. And I think the reality of that is we also know that 500 and odd teams at locality 4 isn't actually a true number of the number of teams we've got in the organisation, because there are a lot of teams who aren't defined by that type of structure. There are lots of sub teams that fit within those teams. So for us, it's only been recently that we've started to get to those numbers, but we've started to grow it to a level where TED is sort of weaved into the fabric of what we do at LTH. So as Sam said in the chat there, yeah, embedding it into other programs, it becomes part and parcel of our leadership development pathways. It's part of our culture conversations that we have in the trust. It's part of our staff survey response as well. So what we've tried to do along the way is intertwine TED with all those different things. And when I'm talking to teams out there in the organization, I'm really encouraged when I'll perhaps talk to a new team who's never engaged with TED in the past, but they already know about it. They've already heard about it either on some of our other comms or from another team who's done it. And that makes it so much easier then to sort of get in and get to start to inform them around, this is how you can get involved with it. These are the benefits you might see at your team level. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it does take time, and it takes time. And if you build on it year on year, you start to get those rewards, as we've been seeing at Lancs Teaching. So the challenge with growth of this kind is that when you set off, you'll have that initial enthusiasm, you'll have those innovators sort of in your back pocket who you know will be super excited to get involved in TED. You know, you'll have those teams who will absolutely want it and who might be crying out for it, that you can definitely support. So you'll be engaging with those priority teams. But the challenge is that you can hit a slump. After that initial enthusiasm wanes, the next steps might be a bit less clear, because those teams don't maybe stand out as much as the first teams that you engage with it. So I want to reassure you that it's absolutely normal to be like that, and that you're not doing anything wrong if you experience this. It's likely that when you've tapped into those initial resources, because you're maybe still working with those teams that are challenged, you don't have those other innovators putting themselves forward, you might feel that it becomes a bit of a struggle. So what I wanted to do is try and set out some of the things that you might do to stimulate other teams to get involved and to keep that momentum that you've already built in your early months and perhaps first year using TED. So that's the question. How do we keep that momentum, especially seeing as it might have seemed easy in the beginning, and now it's maybe starting to slow down? You've experienced that slump and you're wondering what's the right next step to take. So what I've done here is pinched another sort of model, and this is what we refer to as a funnel. So it's sort of a customer funnel, and in TED cases this is a team funnel, and what we want to try and do, our ultimate goal really, is to try and get teams through this funnel into that bottom part where they become loyal customers. They reach that idea, that place where it becomes part and parcel of what they do. They're fully bought into TED and they use it as part of just business as usual in the way they work. So at the top here, we've got initially when you're engaging with new customers, new teams who've maybe not heard about TED before, the goal is to think around, how do we attract them to consider TED? What do we think around, how do we raise that awareness? Once they've got that awareness, it's important to inform them so that they can consider how TED might work in their team. You then want to convert them into someone who takes that leap and has a go at doing TED. And then we can move them into that loyalty phase where they would be doing TED for perhaps the second, third time, and it becomes part and parcel of what they do. So in going through this, what I want you to think around is considering how you're raising awareness about TED in your organisation. And then for those that are aware of TED, in what ways are you informing them around how they can use it? Maybe thinking about what is your format for team leader training, how are you supporting those, who do you want to get involved in it? Then think about how you're encouraging them to take that next step and have a go. And I think in previous sessions, we've talked around sometimes you can put team leaders through that team leader training, but then there's a leap again in getting them to actually take that step and send out the survey, have that conversation with the team. And sometimes that's where you might hit a barrier. And ultimately, as I say, we want to move them to that loyal or repeat customers, those teams who use TED, it's part and parcel of what they do. They maybe don't need that much support, and it's just a case of signposting or a bit of advice each time they go through that cycle. So when we think about raising awareness, some of the things that we've used at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals has really been around how do we get our comms out around TED. We've worked quite a lot on our branding, our colour schemes and things with TED, so that it is something which will stand out and pique people's interest. Things we've used at Lancs Teaching are our own intranet. So we've got a TED intranet page. We put out articles to raise awareness of maybe case studies and things that are going on with TED. We have social media accounts as well. We've got a big Twitter following in our organisation. We also share those case studies, which can be really powerful, but also things like newsletters, signposting from our other training development schemes, like Sam says, embedding it into things like your leadership development programs, maybe your talent management schemes, core management skills courses as well. But also we try to get some FaceTime on different meeting agendas so that we can expose different audiences to TED and really raise awareness of what TED is and how it can help. When we're thinking about that consideration phase, what I'd like you to think around is how do you currently approach team leader training? And what we've done over the years at Lancs Teaching is we've adapted our approach to that. And we found that different formats tend to lend themselves to different audiences. So for instance, when we started doing this 6-7 years ago, it was quite bespoke sessions for set teams who we ran it for when we started out. We then developed our team leader training program and started running that frequently as half-day sessions at the time. And then over the years, we've developed e-learning, we've developed shorter fast track sessions, and we're even thinking about some more longer format sessions for this coming year. So what I'm getting at with this is have a think around if you're hitting that barrier with numbers applying to come on your team leader training, think around, is there a different way that we can offer it? I know some of you out there, some of our trusts will start off with a one-to-one training session. Then you can talk a manager through how to set up their TED, how they might approach their feedback, what could come up, and that can be really valuable. But also it's really difficult to do that for every single manager. So you might be thinking, what other formats do we have that would fit a lot of other team leaders out across our organisation? Next factor then is in conversion, and this is really about that step after team leader training. So the next challenge is about converting those you've trained into those who are actively using TED with the teams. Sometimes this can be a challenge, and I've no doubt some of you have found that of those you get on team leader training, there'll be a certain percentage who'll just go away and run with it, and that's brilliant. There'll be another percentage who may be a bit apprehensive, maybe come back to you for a bit of advice or support, and maybe there's some others who, with the best intentions in the world, intend to do it, but maybe they're waiting for that perfect time. So what I wanted to highlight here is the importance of that framing it correctly when someone first interacts with TED. Remember to frame it as it's just a baseline, that first one that you do. It's not about doing TED and wanting to get all greens the first time you do it. If anything, it can be quite difficult if you get all greens the first time you do it, because you want to have something to build on. You want some clear way forward. But really do encourage your team leaders to see their first one as a baseline, which then gives you that opportunity to say, right, how can we be better when we do it this time next year? Also, what is it about what we've learned from this baseline that we should really celebrate and we really need to highlight is an important part of what we do in our team? Second point on there, remind team leaders that they don't need to have all the answers. I think one of the big struggles and one of the big things that hinders a team leader taking that step to doing the first TED is the idea that maybe they've got an idea what might come up out of their results, but maybe it's about something that they can't control or that they don't know the answer to. So that's where I think coaching support, a bit of advice, maybe letting them speak to other team leaders who have taken that jump can be really helpful for those sorts of team leaders. It's important to remind them that the answers that come out of your TED are for the team to come up with together. And whilst you might have your own ideas on the answers as a team leader, the most successful ones are always when the team generates those solutions together, because it gets that buy-in from everyone that's involved, and it also shows the team that they are part of that decision process and that the decisions that have been made aren't something that's been imposed on them. It's something that they're part of and they're there to shape and learn with. And final point on there, you might have heard this quote before. I didn't put a reference, but I think it's from it's an Italian proverb from Voltaire. So name check to Jude, will be able to check that from me with a extensive Italian knowledge. But this says that perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that really sums it up, that sometimes if you set out on something like this and you're aiming for that perfection, you're actually stopping yourself from getting that momentum and building it up. And the whole idea with TED is that we understand that if anything, we're never at a perfect place, and we want to do this continuous improvement so that next time we come to do our TED survey, have our TED discussion, we're that little bit better than we were the previous time we did it. And the idea that in 3-4 cycles of going through this, we'll have grown together, we'll have learned together, and we'll be that much better than we are now. I think sometimes what can hold team leaders back is wanting to be perfect from day one with the TED and wanting the first TED to show perfect results. So you'll have a team leader who maybe doesn't want to do a TED during winter precious times because they know the team feels stretched, where that engagement might be that little bit lower, or that feeling of communication might be difficult when your members of the team down. So those scores are going to be lower than they would be at other times. But I'd always encourage team leaders to do TED at those times, even more so than when times maybe are a bit calmer, because you can understand so much more about your team, and you can show your team that you understand those pressures that they're going through, and that together you can make those steps to move forward and support each other as you go through a challenge. So final step on our funnel model is in moving those who you've already converted, those who've already done a TED, into loyal or repeat users. So when we think about this is where perhaps our work becomes that little bit easier. When teams have fully bought into the approach, we're most likely to then see those improvements because they're starting to make those sort of gradual improvements over time, but have maybe gone through the cycle once or twice. To get to this, I'd say team needs to have completed TED at least twice. For some, it might be more than that. It might take a few cycles of this for them to really sort of buy into it and feel that it is that business as usual. But the work that we can do here to encourage teams who've already used TED to keep doing it, to do repeat TEDs, is to really think around encouraging them to build on the learning. So as we've said, if we position that first one as the baseline, you only really know if it's worked when they come to do another and you see, actually, has anything changed? Has anything moved? Also emphasize the added benefits that follow-up TEDs can have. So when you do that follow-up TED survey, you get that comparison between this time and your previous TED. You can see what's moved up. You can even see if something's moved down, and that can help to add richness to your TED conversation around what's affecting us. Why might something have gone down? How can we make sure we don't go down any further, or how can we bring it back to where we were? And also see it as that opportunity to understand and evidence your progress. So in answer to that question around how do we evidence the impacts that TED is having, there are different ways we can do that on an organizational level, but a team level, often the best way is to keep doing TED, is to do your second TED and see where you've come since that first time. Do a third TED and see how it's changed and what your journey has been throughout that, and use those opportunities to reflect on the work that's gone on in between. Okay, so I'm going to throw it out to yourselves in a minute in terms of just asking what you've done and you know how this might look in your organization. But I just wanted to link this into to answer the question, how do you know where teams might be up to in that progress? Where might different teams be in that funnel? So using your TED data, you will be able to see which teams are engaging with TED. So you can use your TED data to identify teams who might be ready for follow-ups. Indeed, this is something we've done quite recently at Lancs Teaching in looking back at our team leader data for teams that did TED maybe over 6 to 9 months ago and are maybe coming up to doing that TED. We can give them that nudge with our data from the TED system. We can also use our data in TED to illustrate TED themes. So the themes that are coming out of this, you can see a couple of slides up there that I share to our divisions at Lancs Teaching, highlight which are our strongest performing themes, which might be weaker themes as well, and we can use that to prompt engagement. We can also use our TED data to celebrate successes as well. So we might want to give shout outs to those teams who have done TED. And this is something, again, we do at Lancs Teaching. So each month at our divisional workforce committees, we'll give shout outs to the teams that have done TED. We'll never share the specifics of what their scores were because we protect that psychological safety. But absolutely, we want to give them that recognition for engaging with it, having a go. And last thing you might want to use the data for is thinking about setting yourselves targets. So if you have a look at your TED data and you see that in year one, maybe you did 8 or 9 TEDs, or maybe you did 20 TEDs, maybe you want to double that this year. If you had 10 teams that completed it in year one, maybe your goal is going to be 20. And you might want to think around, how do we re-engage those that have already done this? And how do we attract another 10 to do this? And then the year after you might want to do 40. But think around what's reasonable for you, think around where you're at. But the best way you can do this is look at your existing data and think around what's achievable. Just wanted to bring that back again to our data at Lancs Teaching, because whilst the idea of doubling what you did last year, when you know it's likely you'll have put a lot of work into this and you might be feeling, gosh, we've put all this work in and we've, you know, maybe we've got 10 to 20 teams, we'd like to do so much more. Whilst the idea of doubling what you did last year might seem, you know, really ambitious, it's important to remember that every loyal team you have then becomes a quick win in your numbers, because they're a team who will do it again, perhaps with little or even no effort from yourselves, that they'll just revisit the system. You've got team leaders who are trained up, they'll have their own logins, they can look back at their results. So it might just be as simple as a nudge email or a bit of comms that will help them think about revisiting TED. Also remember that each of those that has used the process has that potential to become an advocate and to be able to talk to others, attract new teams and new team leaders. And I would say that's been our biggest benefit over the years, that every year the more we get involved in TED, the more widely known it becomes across our organisation. If you look back at our journey there on that data, setting out with just 2 teams in 16-17, we then jumped up to 12, then to 37, and on to 95. And if we didn't have a global pandemic, who knows where we'd be now? If we didn't have that dip in 2020. But absolutely, we've been so fortunate to have that growth, and I think a lot of it is down to really trying to encourage teams to use this without being too prescriptive. So having it something there that's offered as a support measure, but really encouraging those benefits so that other teams can use it. Okay, so I've said an awful lot there. I wanted to throw it open to yourselves now. What's been successful for you? What's maybe worked for you already, and maybe what are your plans for this year? Is there anything maybe I've not talked about, something you're thinking about, and maybe wanted to bounce around a few ideas? Any thoughts from anyone?
Just got a question from Rebecca in the chat. Rebecca, I think it was really hard for us to report previously on whether it was brand new teams or cumulative, but we can do that better now. And also teams change so much, and sometimes managers change so much, so it was really, really difficult because of the flexibility we have in TED to enable managers to decide who's in their team, because we think that's really useful in terms of multidisciplinary teams. So we wanted to keep it super flexible. It does then have a bit of an impact on us being able to identify really, really clearly the number of teams, because they can decide, well, yeah, we are a team, but actually I just want to focus on this discipline, or I want to focus on this teams type or role type. So it's really tricky for us, isn't it, Lee, to identify exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely, that's a big driver. I think we've talked in previous sessions around, we want to keep enhancing that data that we get from TED, and some of the features that we're looking to build into the system this year are around helping you understand that data. Because although in our previous system we couldn't quite get the richness that we have now, we understand that the more you can sort of tap into that and learn around what are those pockets of growth, maybe where are those case study opportunities, the more you can start to grow this. But yeah, great question. A few others coming in the chat. Helen, you mentioned you're going putting that new organization structure in place, so absolutely that will help you understand the data in TED again and help you understand how it's fit into different sections of your organization. So yeah, great point, thanks Helen. And Lauren, that link to staff survey, is there a best way to do this? Ideally we'd like to train managers in TED ready for when the results come out. So I absolutely love that question, Lauren, because that segues very nicely into my next slide. Thank you very much. So please do keep typing if there's some of you still coming in, but I'll just touch on this bit about staff survey. So as I said at the start of today's session, we're at that time of year where staff survey takes precedent and it perhaps monopolises a significant amount of your time. So you'll no doubt be planning how you're going to distribute your results, thinking about what themes are arising from that staff survey data, and probably where TED fits in, you'll be thinking around how do you engage teams to take notice of what the staff survey results, but also how do you empower them to do something with it. And that was definitely one of the big drivers for us when we first developed TED, and this is where we really see TED fitting in to that wider engagement cycle that we have in the NHS. I wanted to touch at this point on some of the likely challenges that you get around staff survey when you're action planning, when you're sharing it out there in the organisation. We often get these sorts of questions, so I'm sure you've heard all these before. They're definitely ones we still get around our staff survey and that crops up every year. But people might say things like, oh, our staff survey results are just lost in the sheer volume of data. They might say things like, the feedback was months ago, so it doesn't feel relevant now. And you can definitely understand that feeling. Some teams might say they understand the results, but what are they supposed to do with them? Staff survey gives you these great measures, but if it's telling you that, I don't know, organisational advocacy is a challenge, or that communication's a challenge, how does the team digest that? Where do they start, particularly if they're not used to working on engagement? Other questions, maybe a team might be saying our team hasn't changed despite the feedback in staff survey previously. Maybe they haven't seen that change at a local level. And often it can be difficult then to think around, actually, how do we motivate them around this to use it and see it as valid sort of data that they can use. And the last one here, our team's too small to get a report, so results get lost. And definitely that is always a challenge for us in staff survey because of those anonymity protocols. It's come down slightly this year, so teams of 10 or less will be the only ones who don't get the results, but for those smaller teams it can be a challenge. So that's where we position TED, really. This is where we see TED fitting in as the answer to those sorts of challenges that we get around staff survey. TED is a way that teams can acknowledge the staff survey, understand those higher level themes, but then really drill down to what's specific to them as a team. They can use TED as a way to build on it, and with the toolkits in TED, they can use it as those practical next steps, so that if communication is a challenge for your team, there's a toolkit for that. If team purpose is a concern and there's some different views in your team, then there's a toolkit for that, and you can start to work with your team with practical next steps that are accessible to any sort of team leader. So when we think about staff survey, I have shared this slide before, but I think I saw the question before, when will we share these slides? Absolutely, I'll share these slides and the video recording with you after today. But when you are positioning TED and staff survey, what we want to do, we absolutely want to highlight the importance of the staff survey, because it is our most important measure in an NHS organisation. And where staff survey really gives us that importance is that it covers a broad range of topics that help us to benchmark ourselves against other similar organisations. It also helps us to target our support at an organisational level. But then when you're asking a team to consider TED, sometimes you might get that challenge of, I've gave feedback in staff survey, why should I give feedback in something like TED? So it's really important to position TED as fulfilling a different part of that puzzle. So the advantage with TED is that it gives you a flexible way to understand the factors that are inside your control. It gives you a way that you can use the staff survey on your own terms. So it gives you practical steps where you can implement into maybe a ward-based team that doesn't have formal set meetings, or maybe you can build it into a team away day. I've helped out with a lot of those recently that teams are doing at the start of the year to plan for the year ahead. So it's important to emphasise that TED and the staff survey do have a lot of alignment. They're both research-backed, they're evidence-based, they're safe ways to give feedback, but they both have different purposes in terms of staff survey is that opportunity to influence the organisational picture, but TED is your opportunity to influence your team and to be part of that and be part of that, those next steps for you and your team. So to summarise the key points from today's session, what we're encouraging you to do really is keep momentum and just keep the faith that it does get easier over time. If you hit those barriers, please do talk to us, because we can help you. We can even put you in touch with each other and other trusts who've experienced similar things, but keep sharing with us what you are doing, because that really helps us enhance that support that we can give to others, as well as helping us at Lancs Teaching as well. We've had some great innovative approaches that we've seen from yourselves. Second point there is think about that funnel. So have a look at those slides and think around, are we sort of meeting all the parts of that funnel? Are we thinking about those teams who maybe did it last year, and are we working to make sure they do it again? Because if you can get those follow-up TEDs, that's when you'll start to see that impact. But also, have you thought about maybe adapting some of your comms, because your initial comms around TED might have got one particular audience, but a different type of audience might be more receptive to a different approach. So keep trying to think of new ways and mix it up over time, because it really will help. And then I guess the last and perhaps the most important thing I'd like you to think about is use your data in the TED system. Once you've got your first handful of teams using TED, it then gives you really valuable data to build on. And as you get more and more teams using it, that data becomes more and more valuable. So really do dip into that. It's something which we plan to share with you more as we go throughout the next few months in terms of thinking around how you use that. And as I say, some of the new features coming to TED this year will hopefully help you identify the data that's important for you, and will help you in answering some of those questions that you have. Okay, so final thing, I realise we've about 5, 6 or 7 minutes left, but I wanted to ask you at that point, has anything today stood out to you? Is anything now sort of any light bulbs gone out in your mind that have made you think, oh, we might try this, or this might work really well? Let us know in the chat what you think you might be trying as a takeaway from today's event. Maybe there's something that we haven't mentioned that would be really good to share. So just take a moment, let us know in the chat what you feel would be useful. And then what I'm also going to do, when you've popped those in, I'll pop a feedback link in as well. Sam, would you like to add to that?
I was just going to answer some questions in the chat while everyone's doing their thinking and popping some things in the chat. So I can see, is it Elizabeth from Cantor Chester? So just picking up on the question around the people promise. So we can send you slides that demonstrate where each element of TED link into the people promise and where the alignment is. But specifically, obviously, the We Are a Team is a key theme in there that you can link to TED, but also looking at some of the TED resources as well. So if you're looking at We Are Rewarded and Recognised, actually where can TED support that? So there's lots of activities in there in terms of how could the team celebrate success, or sort of how do we look at our team achievements over time. So that could be something that if you are pulling that theme out with your managers, I don't know what your plans are around the staff survey, but say you were having a focus for managers to try and support them in improving the different aspects of people, the people promise, you could perhaps say, I don't know, this month our focus is on we feel rewarded and recognised. In TED, here are some resources that could support you to develop this within your team. And maybe if there are particular themes for your people promise that you're focusing on, perhaps, as Lee mentioned, with that data analysis opportunity where you could look at some of the questions that link to those themes. So if overall as a trust you're finding that, I keep coming to reward and recognise, but if you're finding that that is an area that you want to sort of go all in on and focus on, perhaps then looking at some of the results in TED as well and seeing what's happening at a local level could support you as well. Does that help?
It really does. Thank you. That's great. I'll definitely get onto the system.
And I've seen that some trusts are doing sort of managers packs with different resources and things that they could do, link into the people promise. So again, that could be where you could embed that. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your comments in the chat. I'm glad you found this session useful. I have popped in the chat, I'll pop it in again, a feedback link. So please do let us know how you're finding these sessions, and if there's any other specific topics you'd like us to cover. We do have a bit of a plan for the next few months, but we're happy to sort of flex those to meet the things that would help you most with what you're doing with TED at the minute. So just to wrap us up, just signpost you to our next events. We'll be running another Lunch and Learn next month. I think that's going to be more specifically on TED data. So we're going to show you some of the ways that we use data at Lancs Teaching. So please do let us know if you've any specific questions you want us to answer as part of that. We've got our coffee catch-ups every month. The next one's the 13th of February, and we've one on the 12th of March as well. And our first quarterly deep dive of the year will be on Tuesday the 19th of March, and I think our plan at the moment with that is to have a more of a focus on staff survey itself, because it's likely around that time when the embargo will be lifting, you'll be starting to do some of this engagement work. So again, please do let us know what your plans are. It will be great to hear what those are and be able to share them as part of that session. So keep in touch with us, we'll keep in touch with you. But if there's no further questions, I'll wrap up there. Thank you all for coming along, and it's lovely to see you all.